I've lived long enough to watch a lot of smart people destroy themselves, and even more disturbingly, destroy entire economy, all because they overdosed on philosophy. Not whiskey, not leverage, philosophy. Somewhere along the way, a strange religion took hold in America. It wasn't Christianity or Marxism. It was a belief that if something happened in a free market, it must be good. No matter how stupid, how reckless, or how destructive it was. That belief came from a woman named Ayn Rand, and her followers have done more damage with their ideas than most criminals do with their hands. Now, don't get me wrong. Ayn Rand wasn't stupid. She was brilliant, persuasive, and dangerously convincing. Her stories made selfishness look heroic. She taught generations of people that greed was not a vice, but a virtue. And for some reason, a lot of people in my own political party thought that was profound. They started reading Atlas Shrugged like it was the Ten Commandments. And before long, they began to believe that the invisible hand of the market was some kind of divine moral compass. It's not. The market isn't moral. It isn't intelligent. It's just a machine powered by human nature. And human nature, I assure you, is a messy thing. I once said, if anything happened as a natural response of human nature in a free market system, even if it was an axe murder, it was considered a desirable development. I wasn't joking. People actually started to think that way. They called it creative destruction. That's a fancy phrase for doing dumb things and pretending it's progress. You see, in theory, markets are elegant, but in practice, they're full of envy, fear, and idiocy. The invisible hand may guide you, but sometimes it's just picking your pocket. The trouble started when this Randian nonsense slipped into places it never should have gone, like the Federal Reserve. Alan Greenspan, who was brilliant in many ways, was also a lifelong disciple of Ayn Rand. He believed the market could self-correct, that regulations were unnecessary, and that humans, left alone, would behave rationally. That's one of the dumbest ideas ever believed by grown-ups. Humans are not rational. They are predictably irrational. Give them cheap credit, they'll borrow too much. Give them leverage, they'll overdo it. Give them freedom, and they'll invent new ways to be stupid. I watched the so-called financial innovation of the 2000s. People said this will diversify risk. They even said it with a straight face. You know what those innovations really did? They multiplied stupidity at the speed of light. I once joked, if the phrase financial innovation that diversifies risk had been banned from all discourse, the country would have worked better. And I wasn't joking either, because every time you hear that phrase, it's a signal that someone's trying to sell you a bomb, wrapped in the language of progress. You see, the great irony is this. These people worship the free market as if it were flawless. They thought regulation was evil, that government was the problem, and that human beings would behave perfectly if left to their own devices. That's not capitalism. That's a fairy tale. Capitalism works because it restrains stupidity, not because it celebrates it. It rewards discipline, prudence, and rationality, not delusion dressed up as innovation. But when you overdose on Ayn Rand, you stop believing in limits. You start thinking greed will save you. You start calling recklessness freedom. And then, before you know it, you're knee-deep in mortgage-backed garbage and wondering why the system collapsed. This isn't just about finance. It's about intellectual humility. It's about knowing that no theory, no matter how elegant, can override human folly. You can't model stupidity out of existence. You can only prepare for it. Ayn Rand's world is clean, moral, and logical. The real world is dirty, emotional, and irrational. That's why the Randian overdose is so dangerous. It gives people the illusion of understanding in a system built on chaos. The best investors and the best thinkers accept that truth. They don't worship markets. They study behavior. They don't chase innovation. They look for simplicity that endures. And most importantly, they understand that freedom without wisdom is just a fancy form of self-destruction. So when I hear people say, markets will fix themselves, I just smile. That's like saying, alcoholics will sober up if you give them more whiskey. If you want to understand capitalism, stop reading Ayn Rand and start reading a balance sheet. You'll find the truth there, in debt, in leverage, in the very human habit of overreaching. Capitalism doesn't need to be worshipped. It needs to be managed by people who know the difference between liberty and lunacy. Because when ideology replaces judgment, you don't get progress. You get disaster, the kind that always arrives with the words, "Don't worry, it'll work itself out." It never does. Let me tell you something uncomfortable. Markets are wonderful engines of progress until they start believing in their own mythology. The free market isn't God. It doesn't bless virtue or punish sin. It just reacts to incentives, and often those incentives are perverse. Now, I've watched generations of bright people turn their brains off because they thought the market knows best. They weren't thinking anymore. They were worshiping. And when you worship the market, you stop asking hard questions. I remember sitting through meetings where people said, "Don't worry, Charlie, it's self-correcting." You know what I call that? A bedtime story for adults. Self-correcting systems are only as good as the people running them. And when the people are greedy, lazy, or blind, no invisible hand is going to bail them out. That's the part the Ayn Rand crowd never understood. They read Atlas Shrugged and thought it was an economics textbook. It's not. It's a novel, a fantasy where every entrepreneur is a genius and every bureaucrat is a villain. Real life is messier. Some entrepreneurs are crooks. Some bureaucrats save your skin. It's not about ideology. It's about outcomes. But when you live on theory, you stop seeing the difference between freedom and foolishness. And that's exactly what happened in the mortgage bubble. Every financial salesman, every trader, every half-brained quant was chanting the same hymn. We're diversifying risk. They said it so often that people stopped asking what it meant. It was the perfect slogan. Half math, half religion, all nonsense. What they were really doing was slicing garbage into smaller pieces and pretending it smelled better. And the regulators, those brilliant disciples of free market purity, stood there nodding like bobbleheads. Because according to the gospel of Ayn Rand, regulation was heresy. So they let the whole machine run itself until it blew up right on schedule. That's the problem with intellectual arrogance. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It seeps in quietly, disguised as sophistication. People say, "We understand the risk," when what they really mean is, we're too proud to admit we don't. Alan Greenspan once testified before Congress after the crisis. He said he had found a flaw in his model of how markets work. I remember shaking my head and thinking, that's a polite way of saying you believed in Santa Claus for 30 years. Now, I actually like Greenspan. He's a very smart man, but even smart men go crazy when they confuse ideology for reality. And that's what this overdose of Ayn Rand did. It made smart people forget common sense. It's not complicated. When you give human beings cheap money, they'll spend it. When you reward risk-taking, they'll gamble. And when you tell them the market will fix everything, they'll believe it right up until the crash. Then they'll run to the same government they used to mock and beg for a bailout. That's the beautiful hypocrisy of the free market faith. It preaches self-reliance, but when the house burns down, it wants the taxpayer to bring the hose. Buffett and I have seen this movie before. And it's always the same script. Greed, leverage, denial, collapse, regret. And then the same crowd of geniuses says, this time it's different. It never is. See, the world doesn't collapse because of bad ideas alone. It collapses because people refuse to question them. They get hooked on the story that progress is automatic, that innovation always wins, that capitalism is magic. It's not magic. It's math and behavior doesn't change much. The truth is, a little regulation, a little skepticism, and a healthy fear of stupidity are what keep capitalism alive. Take those away, and it starts to eat itself. People think rules and ethics are the enemy of freedom. They're not. They're the scaffolding that keeps freedom from collapsing. I once said, there are some things that should be forbidden, and I meant it. Not because I hate the free market, but because I love what it can do when people aren't abusing it. If the market were truly self-correcting, it wouldn't need bailouts every decade. It wouldn't need regulators cleaning up after geniuses. And it wouldn't keep repeating the same disasters under new names like innovation or liquidity. The real miracle of capitalism isn't that it works perfectly. It's that it works at all, in spite of human nature. You can't fix human folly with ideology. You can only manage it with structure, discipline, and humility. Three things Ayn Rand never wrote much about. So when people say, we just need to get government out of the way, I tell them, fine, but don't complain when your invisible hand slaps you in the face. Because in the end, the problem isn't capitalism. It's the cult that pretends it's flawless. That's the overdose talking. And the side effects are always the same. Arrogance first, bankruptcy later. Every few decades, Wall Street invents a new bedtime story to help smart people fall asleep while they're being robbed. In my lifetime, they've used many names: derivatives, securitization, structured products, crypto, all variations of the same delusion, that you can outsmart risk by giving it a fancy new costume. They call it financial innovation. I call it tooth fairy economics, because believing that risk disappears when you slice it into pieces is like believing your tooth disappears when you hide it under the pillow. You may feel clever, but you'll wake up broke. When people ask me what caused the financial crisis, I tell them it was the triumph of imagination over arithmetic. Banks and investors actually convinced themselves that if you bundled enough garbage together, it would magically transform into gold. They even hired mathematicians to prove it. Not investors, mathematicians. They built models so complex that nobody understood them. That's how you know it's fraud, when the people selling it can't explain it in plain English. The sales pitch was always the same. This product will diversify risk. That phrase alone should set off alarms. I once joked that if the words financial innovation that diversifies risk had been banned from public discourse, the country would have been better off. I meant it. Those words have done more harm to capitalism than any government ever could, because behind them was a simple lie that human behavior had changed. It hadn't. People were still greedy, overconfident, and desperate to believe in shortcuts. The only innovation was how creatively they could disguise stupidity. I've seen this before. In the 1970s, there were Nifty 50 stocks that could never fall. In the 1990s, there were dot-coms that didn't need profits. In the 2000s, there were mortgages that didn't need down payments. And today, it's digital tokens that don't need cash flow. Different names, same fairy tale. What all these innovations had in common was this: they turned ignorance into a product and sold it as sophistication. And Wall Street, being a highly creative place, built entire empires on that ignorance. They packaged risk, insured it, reinsured it, then bet against it. It was like a casino where the house and the players were the same people. And somehow they all thought they'd win. When the whole mess finally collapsed, everyone acted surprised. They said nobody could have seen this coming. Really, it was like watching a man set his house on fire and then being shocked it burned down. You see, the root problem isn't leverage or derivatives. It's the belief that intelligence cancels risk. It doesn't. It multiplies it because intelligence breeds arrogance, and arrogance blinds you to the obvious. I've always preferred simplicity. If something is too complicated to understand, it's probably too dangerous to own. Warren and I built Berkshire by avoiding complexity and not chasing it. We never tried to be the smartest guys in the room. We tried to be the least stupid. That's a better game. But modern finance doesn't reward humility. It rewards performance. And performance is often just leverage with a press release. Everyone looks brilliant until the tide goes out. Then you find out who is swimming naked. Here's the sad part. After every crash, society learns nothing. We just change the vocabulary. We say, this time it's different. And somehow we believe it. When the dust settles, the academics write papers, the regulators hold hearings, and Wall Street prepares the next product to spread risk. Now, they'll even say it with pride, as if the phrase hasn't already destroyed trillions of dollars. I call that institutionalized amnesia. It's what keeps the financial industry in business. So, what should a rational investor do? First, assume that every innovation is guilty until proven innocent. Second, remember that complexity is the enemy of reliability. And third, never trust a salesman who says, don't worry, the model accounts for that. Because in my experience, models account for everything except reality. You don't need innovation to get rich. You need patience, discipline, and the ability to say no. That's not sexy, but it works and it won't blow up the global economy. Let me give you a secret Wall Street hates. Most new financial products exist not to create wealth, but to extract it from you. They're engineered to confuse, to make you feel unsophisticated, to turn ordinary people into counterparties. In short, financial innovation is a magician's trick. While you're watching the shiny object, the real money is quietly leaving your pocket. The solution isn't banning creativity. It's banning stupidity. There's the difference. Innovation that truly improves the world makes things simpler, cheaper, or safer. Innovation that just enriches middlemen deserves to die quietly in a footnote of financial history. I'm not against progress. I'm just against nonsense. And most of what passes for progress on Wall Street is just old greed in new packaging. If you want to survive in this business, I remember this rule. The moment you hear the phrase financial innovation, grab your wallet and run, because the only thing being diversified is your money away from you. Every bubble in history, from tulips to tech stocks, has one thing in common. It isn't interest rates. It isn't policy mistakes. It's human nature. And human nature doesn't evolve. It just repeats itself with better technology. People think capitalism runs on competition, but that's not true. It runs on emotion, fear and greed. Those two forces drive the whole system. You can't regulate them. You can't model them. You can only survive them if you know they're permanent. When I was young, I watched people lose everything in the Great Depression, not because they weren't smart, but because they thought, this time is different. No, that phrase has bankrupted more people than debt ever did. Decade after decade, it's the same pattern. Something new arrives. People get rich quickly. Others get jealous. And the last fools rush in, thinking they're geniuses. Then it all burns down and everyone swears they'll never do it again. Until they do. Human beings are wired for stories, not statistics. And the story of easy money never goes out of style. Look at the housing bubble in the 2000s. People didn't buy homes, they bought hope. They didn't see a loan. They saw freedom. They weren't thinking about risk. They were thinking about the neighbor who just made a fortune flipping houses. That's the real contagion, envy, the deadliest disease in capitalism. It spreads faster than any virus. You can give people facts, but envy will always win. It doesn't care about math. It only cares about comparison. I used to say, it's not greed that drives the world, it's envy. And I meant it. Greed has limits. You can satisfy it. Envy is endless. That's why people buy stocks they don't understand, leverage money they don't have, and chase trends they can't sustain. They'd rather lose everything than feel left out. Now, economists like to pretend they can predict bubbles. They draw curves, build models, and publish papers, but none of them can model stupidity at scale. And stupidity is scalable. It grows in crowds, in boardrooms, and on television screens. It grows wherever there's applause for fast money. When everyone around you is making a killing, rationality feels like cowardice. That's the psychological trap of every mania. The smartest people in the room start acting like fools because they can't stand watching idiots get rich. I've seen PhDs fall for pyramid schemes. I've seen hedge fund managers beg to buy into bubbles they mocked 6 months earlier. And I've seen entire nations believe they can borrow their way to prosperity. You don't need to be evil to create a crisis. You just need to be human. That's why I laugh when people say, next time we'll learn our lesson. No, they won't. The form changes, the delusion doesn't. In the 1990s, it was dot-com stocks. In the 2000 subprime mortgages. In the 2020s, digital assets. Each generation invents its own excuse to repeat the same stupidity. They all say, it's new technology, Charlie, you don't understand. And they're right about one thing. I don't understand why people think gravity stops working for them. When prices go up forever, people think it's because they're smart. When they crash, they think it's bad luck. They never see the cause, their own behavior. Warren likes to say, what the wise man does in the beginning, the fool does in the end. That line should be carved on every stock certificate. The wise buy when others are fearful. The fools buy when CNBC says the future is bright. And that cycle is eternal. Markets don't create bubbles. People do, one rationalization at a time. They tell themselves, this is safe. This time it's different. I'll get out before it crashes. 3 lies that never go out of fashion. If you want to avoid disaster, stop chasing crowds. Crowds are rarely right, never early. Their emotional thermostat's always reacting, never thinking. The cure for bubbles isn't regulation or innovation. It's self-awareness. It's realizing that your brain is not built for rational investing. It's built for survival in the jungle, not the stock market. When prices rise, your instincts scream, don't miss out. When they fall, they scream, run for your life. That's biology, not intelligence. To beat that, you need discipline and the willingness to look stupid while others look brilliant. That's the real test of character. Every great investor has one thing in common. They sit out when others go mad. They don't fight the bubble. They sidestep it. They don't need to predict the crash. They just avoid participating in the insanity. That's what Munger calls rational patience. You wait, you watch, and you let stupidity burn itself out. Because if you learn nothing else from history, learn this. The fuel of every bubble isn't innovation or greed. It's the refusal to accept that we're still the same foolish animals we've always been. And until human nature changes, which it won't, bubbles will keep coming back, dressed in new jargon, promising a smarter world. The only real innovation in finance is the creativity of human delusion. Every time a crisis hits, politicians rush to the cameras to say, we didn't see it coming. That's nonsense. They saw it. They just didn't want to do anything that might cost votes or campaign donations. Politics and markets have always had a toxic relationship, like two addicts enabling each other's worst habits. The market wants cheap money. The politicians want a booming economy. And neither side cares what happens next year, as long as everything looks fine today. That's how you end up with bubbles and bailouts and speeches about learning lessons that nobody actually learns. Now, I've never had much faith in government competence, but I have even less faith in markets without boundaries. When you mix greed with ideology, you get disasters that textbooks later call unforeseen. The truth is, both sides lie to themselves. Politicians pretend they can engineer prosperity. Markets pretend they can regulate themselves. And between those two delusions, the middle class gets crushed. During the mortgage mania, everyone played their part. The banks lent recklessly. The borrowers lied about income. The rating agencies rubber-stamped garbage. And Washington applauded the whole thing because rising home prices made voters happy. That's not capitalism. That's politics and drag. And when it all collapsed, the same politicians who said, the market knows best, suddenly discovered socialism for the rich. They bailed out the banks, subsidized the risk takers, and called it stabilizing the system. What a joke. That's not free enterprise. That's privatized gains and socialized losses. Heads they win, tails you pay. It's easy to preach free market purity when things go well. It's much harder when the bill comes due. Suddenly, the invisible hand needs a very visible rescue. I'm a capitalist, but I'm not blind. A society that keeps rewarding recklessness eventually runs out of money and trust. You can't have capitalism without responsibility. You can't have liberty without limits. And you sure as hell can't have a sound economy if every crisis ends with the same clowns getting rescued. When I look at some of the loudest voices in the business world, I see people who overdosed on Ayn Rand and then discovered Keynes in the emergency room. They want to be John Galt on the way up and Franklin Roosevelt on the way down. That's not philosophy, that's hypocrisy. The market needs rules the same way sports need referees. You don't get a better game by firing the umpire. You just get chaos and cheating. But in America, we keep electing referees who either don't know the rules or are being paid by one of the teams. That's why I've always said there are some things that should be forbidden. Well, you don't allow banks to gamble with other people's deposits. You don't let lobbyists write financial laws. And you don't let Wall Street convince the government that complexity equals progress. We've already seen how that movie ends. 1929, 1987, 2008, different cast, same stupidity. It's not that regulation solves everything. It doesn't. It just keeps the worst impulses in check, like speed limits. They don't stop accidents, but they reduce the body count. A free market without ethical guardrails isn't freedom. It's a feeding frenzy. And the people who get eaten are usually the ones who trusted the system. When Buffett and I buy businesses, we prefer dealing with owners who have integrity, people who build value, not headlines. That's capitalism at its best. Simple, honest, long-term thinking. But that kind of capitalism doesn't make the news. It doesn't fund campaigns. It doesn't throw lavish conferences about the future of finance. Instead, it quietly compounds wealth and sanity, and nobody wants to hear that story because it's boring, slow, and responsible. You can't sell patience to a crowd drunk on speculation. And you can't win elections by telling people the truth, that not everyone deserves a bailout, and not every problem can be solved with more debt. So the cycle continues. Markets inflate, politiciens congratulate, and taxpayers clean up the mess. I sometimes joke that The politicians are never so bad that you don't live to want them back. That's dark humor, but it's also the truth. We keep swinging between extremes. Too much faith in markets, too much faith in government, and somewhere in between lies what actually works. Prudence, accountability, and the willingness to say no when everyone else says yes. That's not ideology. That's maturity. But maturity doesn't win elections, and it doesn't sell financial products. So we keep overdosing on simple stories. Free markets will fix everything. Government will save everyone until both prove false and we start the same stupidity all over again. Ayn Rand taught people to idolize freedom. She forgot to warn them that freedom without self-restraint becomes a weapon of self-destruction. And when you mix that with politics, it becomes a national hobby. People love to say that capitalism is amoral, that it's just numbers, supply and demand, a neutral system that rewards merit and punishes stupidity. That sounds nice in a textbook, but in real life, it's a lie. Every system reflects the morality of the people running it. If you fill a market with crooks, you'll get crooked outcomes. If you fill it with fools, you'll get chaos. A market doesn't produce virtue automatically. It produces whatever behavior gets rewarded. And for too long, we've rewarded the wrong things. We reward quarterly profits over long-term integrity. We reward debt over discipline. We reward charisma over competence. And then we act surprised when the system rots from the inside. That's not a failure of capitalism. That's a failure of character. See, Ayn Rand's great mistake wasn't that she praised freedom. It's that she assumed freedom automatically creates wisdom. It doesn't. Freedom without judgment just gives idiots a bigger playground. Rand believed that human beings are rational, that if left alone, they'll make choices based on reason and self-interest. She clearly never met a derivatives trader in 2007. Rationality isn't our default setting. Delusion is. People can rationalize anything. Greed, fraud, even self-destruction, if the crowd agrees it's normal. That's why I always say, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. You don't need philosophy for that, just observation. If you pay executives for short-term performance, you'll get short-term thinking. If you let them walk away rich after destroying value, you'll get repeat offenders. And if you call that the free market, you're not defending capitalism. You're killing it. Capitalism without ethics is like engineering without gravity. It doesn't work. It collapses under its own brilliance. And that's the irony. The same people who claim to defend free enterprise often behave in ways that make it unsustainable. They talk about liberty, but what they really mean is license, the freedom to do whatever they want without consequences. They confuse competence with entitlement and wealth with virtue. It's a very old mistake. When I was younger, there was an idea called the Protestant work ethic, that you worked hard, saved money, and didn't act like a fool when you succeeded. Now we've replaced that with the celebrity finance ethic. Flashy, over-leveraged, and morally hollow. It's funny. The older I get, the more radical common sense sounds. Telling people to live within their means, to keep promises, to avoid debt, to save for the future. That used to be normal. Now it's contrarian. You can't build a stable economy on the idea that everyone deserves everything instantly. That's not freedom. That's fantasy. Real capitalism is slow, disciplined, and sometimes painfully boring. It's the process of doing the right thing repeatedly, not the exciting thing impulsively. But excitement says, and prudence doesn't. That's why Wall Street prefers Ayn Rand to Benjamin Franklin. Rand gave them a moral excuse for greed. Franklin gave them a mirror. Rand's world is filled with heroes who deserve their success. The real world is filled with people who can't tell luck from skill. And when luck runs out, they start writing memoirs about unexpected events. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not anti-freedom. I'm just pro-responsibility. Freedom is wonderful when it's coupled with duty. Without duty, it's just noise. A society that worships freedom and ignores virtue will eventually lose both. You can't separate economics from ethics. They're two sides of the same coin. And when one side fades, the whole currency loses value. You see it everywhere today. People treating markets like casinos. CEOs treating shareholders like marks. Politicians treating deficits like magic tricks. And investors treating speculation like a lifestyle. That's not capitalism. That's moral decay with a Bloomberg terminal. The most underrated economic force isn't innovation or policy. It's trust. When people stop trusting institutions, the cost of everything goes up because everyone starts protecting themselves instead of producing. When trust these, contracts get longer, lawyers get richer, and progress slows down. That's why ethics aren't optional. They're efficient. They're good business. Warren and I have built Berkshire on one simple rule. Don't do anything you wouldn't want to explain on the front page of tomorrow's newspaper. That rule is worth more than 1,000 regulations. You can't legislate morality, but you can live it. And the more people who do, the better the system works. Without slogans, without ideology, and without pretending that freedom is an excuse for stupidity. Freedom isn't the absence of rules. It's the presence of wisdom. And wisdom is hard to scale, which is why every generation seems determined to learn the same lessons the hard way. Ayn Rand sold a fantasy of heroic individualism. But real heroes aren't the ones shouting about freedom. They're the ones quietly doing the right thing when no one's watching. That's what keeps capitalism moral. Not invisible hands, but visible consciences. You'd think that after centuries of boom and bust, people in finance would have developed a little common sense. But no, every new generation walks in thinking they're smarter than gravity. I've seen it for 70 years. Each wave of financial geniuses invents a new way to get rich faster, a new vocabulary to explain why this time is different, and a new excuse when it all collapses. What they never invent is wisdom, because wisdom isn't exciting. It doesn't get you on CNBC. It doesn't promise instant wealth. It just quietly compounds. That's why it's so rare. The world has no shortage of IQ points. It has a shortage of temperament, the ability to stay sane when everyone else loses their minds. I've met plenty of people far smarter than me. They could quote Keynes, Einstein, and Milton Friedman in the same sentence. But when greed or fear kicked in, they turned into gamblers with diplomas. The problem with high intelligence is that it breeds overconfidence. The smarter you are, the easier it is to invent a justification for doing something stupid. You don't call it greed, you call it strategy. You don't call it speculation, you call it innovation. And then you end up broke, surprised that your unique insight was just the same old mistake with better marketing. Common sense doesn't require brilliance. It requires humility. And humility is in short supply, especially on Wall Street. If you ever want to laugh, read the prospectus of a failed financial product. It's like poetry written by a committee of delusional optimists. Every risk is mitigated, every assumption is reasonable, and every disaster was unforeseeable. That apparently the smartest people in the world keep being surprised by the same things: debt, leverage, and human stupidity. You know what that tells me? They're not actually surprised. They just never believed it could happen to them. That's the central delusion of finance. I'll be smarter than the last fool. Well, the last fool thought the same thing. At Berkshire, we've never been interested in looking brilliant. We're interested in staying solvent. That's a very different goal. The world doesn't reward you for genius that explodes. It rewards you for competence that endures. I'd rather be consistently reasonable than occasionally spectacular. That's how compounding works. Slow, boring, relentless. But boredom is intolerable to most people in finance. They crave excitement. They need the adrenaline rush of new trades, new toys, new theories. They confuse activity with intelligence. So they create complexity because complexity justifies their existence. They can't tell their clients, sit still and let time do the work. That doesn't pay for the Hamptons house. Instead, they say, we've developed a proprietary model to capture alpha, which usually means we've found a new way to charge you for luck. That's why I say, in the corporate world, if you have too many geniuses and not enough adults, you're in trouble. And adults understand that most of life is maintenance. It's not about constant reinvention. It's about consistency and restraint. The best investors I know are masters of inaction. They spend most of their time reading, thinking, and waiting for fat pitches. When opportunity comes, they act decisively. The rest of the time, they sit on their hands. That's not genius, that's patience. But patience looks like stupidity. In a world addicted to action, Wall Street laughs at patience. It worships momentum, and momentum always ends the same way, with the sound of air hissing out of a bubble. You can see it in every market mania. Brilliant people chasing each other's tails. Funds copying funds, analysts quoting analysts. Everyone convinced they're early until the doorframe catches fire and there's no exit left. That's not intelligence. That's herd behavior with better suits. I've learned something important. Being smart doesn't help much if you can't stay rational. And staying rational is mostly about resisting your own impulses. That's why investing is so hard. You're not competing against the market. You're competing against your own psychology. People think investing is about analysis. It's not. It's about character. Can you stay calm when everyone else panics? Can you avoid greed when everyone else gets rich? Can you admit ignorance when the crowd screams certainty? If you can do those three things, you'll outperform 90% of the market. Not because you're brilliant, but because you're less stupid. That's the real edge. I once said, it's remarkable how much long-term advantage people like us have by trying to be consistently not stupid instead of trying to be very intelligent. And that's still true. In a world obsessed with being clever, the surest way to win is to be sane. The reason common sense is rare in finance is that it doesn't pay immediate dividends. It doesn't flatter the ego. It doesn't make headlines, but it keeps you alive. And survival, not brilliance, not theory, not innovation, is the foundation of every fortune that lasts. Because in the end, the market doesn't care how smart you are. It only cares how long you can stay in the game. If stupidity were painful, humanity would have gone extinct long ago. Unfortunately, it's usually profitable for a while. That's why we keep doing it. Every major financial disaster starts with a simple idea and ends with everyone pretending it was unpredictable. But it's never unpredictable. It's just unpleasant to admit. I've said it before. Most people don't learn from history because they weren't the ones who got burned last time. They think they're smarter, faster, or somehow immune. That's how every new wave of fools feels right before they drown. The real cost of stupidity isn't just money. It's trust. It's time. It's the permanent erosion of common sense. Money can be printed. Trust can't. And once a society starts rewarding the wrong behavior long enough, you end up with institutions that look impressive, and think like toddlers. Take the mortgage crisis. Millions of people thought they were buying homes when really they were buying lottery tickets. Banks thought they were managing risk when really they were just rearranging explosives. And politicians thought they were expanding the American dream when they were actually subsidizing delusion. It was stupidity on a national scale, marketed as innovation. And when the whole thing collapsed, did anyone go to jail? Not really, because the system doesn't punish stupidity. It recycles it. It just waits for the next generation of geniuses to come along with the same arrogance in a different suit. You see, capitalism without failure is like religion without sin. It doesn't mean anything, but we've built an economy that refuses to let anyone truly fail, at least not the big guys. The small investor loses his savings. The average worker loses his job. The executives, they get retirement packages. Failure has become a luxury item. That's the moral hazard I'm talking about. When stupidity has no consequences, it flourishes. And it doesn't stop at finance. You see it in politics, in education, in culture, a society allergic to accountability. People say, we can't afford another collapse. That's true. But we also can't afford another bailout, because every rescue teaches the same bad lesson. Play dumb long enough and someone will save you. That's how you end up with an economy full of gamblers who think they're investors. You want to know why Berkshire works? Because we never needed to be rescued. We kept cash. We stayed boring. We accepted that markets crash. And we made peace with the idea that pain is part of discipline. That's what most people can't do. They want capitalism without suffering. They want reward without restraint. They want to win every bet and call it freedom. But freedom isn't free of consequences. It's the privilege to bear them yourself. The price of avoiding stupidity is humility. And humility is expensive because it forces you to say, I don't know. Most people would rather go broke than say that. That's why I tell young investors, if you want to get rich slowly, study history. If you want to go broke quickly, study trends. Trends make you feel smart right until they stop working. History makes you cautious, and caution is what keeps you alive. I once watched a young man brag about his trading system. He told me he'd never had a losing month. I said, congratulations, you've just described a time bomb. A few years later, I was right. He disappeared along with his fund. That's not a coincidence. That's physics. Gravity always wins in the end. And stupidity is just another way of trying to escape gravity. People don't fail because they're dumb. They fail because they don't know they're dumb. That's the real tragedy of human behavior. Our confidence always exceeds our competence. That's why I prefer simple systems. Simple rules, simple investments. They leave less room for self-deception. The moment you believe you've outgrown stupidity, you're already neck deep in it. Look around today, the signs are everywhere. Speculation dressed as innovation. Debt disguised as growth. Greed justified as optimism. Every generation creates new jargon to avoid saying the word bubble. But a bubble doesn't care what you call it. It only cares how much you pay for it. And the bill always arrives. The sad part is we could learn. We could build systems that reward prudence and punish recklessness. But that would require patience. And patience doesn't trend on social media. So the world keeps paying tuition to the same cruel teacher, experience. And experience charges the highest interest rate in the world. You don't have to be a genius to learn from history. You just have to be honest. But honesty is uncomfortable. It means admitting you're not special, that the laws of economics apply to you too. That's a bitter pill. Most people would rather chase the next miracle cure. Ayn Rand promised them a world of perfect logic. They believed her and then blamed reality for not cooperating. Reality always wins. It just takes longer than people expect. The markets don't forgive stupidity. They just forget it long enough to repeat it. And that, my friends, is why wisdom compounds, but stupidity compounds faster. People love to talk about financial freedom, but the only real financial freedom is the ability to say no. No to stupidity, no to envy, no to the illusion of easy money. The path to wealth isn't paved with yes. It's paved with disciplined refusals. I've spent a lifetime watching intelligent people destroy themselves, not because they didn't know what to do, but because they couldn't resist doing the opposite. The world doesn't reward the smartest investors. It rewards the most rational ones. Rationality is simply the ability to keep your head when everyone else is losing theirs, and, more importantly, when everyone else is making money. Most people think the opposite of stupidity is genius. It's not. It's self-control. If you can't control your emotions, you can forget about controlling your outcomes. Markets are designed to test your patience, not your intelligence. They will tempt you, humiliate you, and offer you shortcuts until you can't resist anymore. That's why most fortunes are lost in prosperity, not in poverty. When times are good, discipline looks unnecessary, caution looks cowardly, and saying no looks stupid. But every no that you enforce during the mania is a yes to survival when the mania ends. Warren and I built Berkshire on that principle. We've said no far more often than we've said yes. We avoided things we didn't understand. We passed on companies that looked perfect on paper. We ignored the crowd when it got noisy. It's not exciting, but it's why we're still here. The truth is, opportunity is overrated. Restraint is underrated. Everyone wants to find the next big thing. Almost nobody wants to sit quietly and let compounding do the work. You don't need constant motion to succeed. You need consistent rationality. That's the hardest thing in a world addicted to novelty. Rationality doesn't mean you're emotionless. It means you're aware of your emotions and choose not to obey them. It means when the crowd says, "This is the future," you ask, "At what price?" When people say, "You're missing out," you ask, "Missing out on what exactly?" Rational people aren't contrarians for sport. They're just unwilling to be stupid for company. And that's an important distinction. There's no prize for being different. There's only a prize for being right. And sometimes being right means doing nothing. I've said before, the big money is not in the buying or the selling, but in the waiting. That's true for wealth. It's also true for wisdom. Patience compounds just like capital does. Every foolish decision you avoid adds to your long-term return. Every temptation you resist keeps your capital intact for the next real opportunity. That's what restraint is. The quiet, invisible skill that keeps fools from dragging you down with them. You'll notice the older people get, the less they talk about getting rich quick, and the more they talk about staying rich slowly. That's not cynicism. That's experience. The best investors I know aren't adrenalina junkies. They're stoics with calculators. They don't chase trends. They wait for the obvious. And when they act decisively because waiting gave them clarity. That's how rationality works. It's not about predicting the future. It's about preparing for it. You can't predict when people will go crazy, but you can predict that they will go crazy. And when they do, you don't join them. You step aside and let gravity do the teaching. That's the secret of saying no. It's not negativity. It's self-preservation. It takes courage to do nothing. It takes maturity to let others be wrong. It takes strength to stay calm when stupidity gets rewarded. Most people can't do it. That's why most people lose. The world always tempts you with opportunity, but opportunity is useless without discipline. Restraint is the hidden edge, the thing nobody wants to hear about, because it's not fun, not glamorous, and not easy to sell. Wall Street doesn't make money teaching restraint. It makes money selling excitement. And excitement is the mortal enemy of good judgment. I once said, take the high road, it's less crowded. That applies to investing too. You'll never have a traffic jam on the road of patience. If you learn to say no more often, you'll not only make more money, you'll sleep better. Because in the long run, rationality outperforms brilliance, and restraint outlasts luck. And when the next bubble comes, and it always does, you won't need a forecast. You'll just need a chair, a book, and the word no. That's the closest thing to financial enlightenment you'll ever find. People talk about freedom as if it's a gift, something handed to you by birthright. It's not. Freedom is a burden. It demands judgment, restraint, and an understanding of consequences. Without those, freedom collapses into chaos. That's true in life, in politics, and especially in markets. I've lived through depressions, bubbles, wars, and booms. I've watched empires rise and vanish, not because they lacked freedom, but because they lacked discipline. Discipline is the oxygen of freedom. Without it, the system chokes itself to death. That's the lesson the Ayn Rand disciples never understood. They worshiped liberty but despised limits. They thought self-restraint was weakness, that the market was a perfect machine guided by invisible virtue. They were wrong on both counts. The market is a mirror. It reflects what we are. And if you fill it with arrogance, greed, and denial, don't be shocked when the reflection looks monstrous. Ayn Rand's philosophy made freedom sound effortless, as if logic and reason would always triumph. But I've seen far more people lose fortunes by overestimating their reason than by following their instincts. You can't logic your way out of envy. You can't rationalize your way out of fear. You can only manage them. Freedom gives you the right to make mistakes. Discipline keeps those mistakes from killing you. Warren and I never tried to be heroes of capitalism. We just tried not to be idiots. That's a much smaller but far more sustainable goal. The people who blow up in markets are rarely the lazy or the dumb. They're the brilliant ones who can't stop touching the stove. They think freedom means no boundaries. But the smart investor knows boundaries are the reason you survive the fire. Every investor wants independence, but independence without discipline is self-destruction. It's like giving a toddler a chainsaw and calling it personal freedom. Freedom, properly understood, means responsibility. It means owning your decisions and their consequences. It means understanding that the price of your liberty is the willingness to act wisely when no one's watching. The great irony of capitalism is this. It works best when people behave as if it could fail at any moment. That humility is what keeps it honest. The moment we start believing markets can't fail, or that the system will always correct itself, we've already planted the seeds of the next collapse. A healthy society doesn't acknowledge freedom. It earns it daily through discipline, ethics, and self-restraint. It understands that rights come with duties, that wealth comes with responsibility, and that power, left unchecked, always decays into stupidity. That's why I've spent my life preaching the boring virtues. Rationality, patience, caution, prudence, not because they're fashionable, but because they work. The people who survive in capitalism aren't the most brilliant or the most daring. They're the ones who know when to stop, when to wait, and when to admit they don't know. There's an old saying, chains of habit are too light to be felt until they are too heavy to be broken. That applies to nations as much as individuals. Our bad habits, debt, greed, self-deception, feel harmless until they suddenly aren't. The cure isn't revolution. It's responsibility. It's returning to the simple, unfashionable idea that actions have consequences and that morality is the most underrated form of intelligence. You can't outsource wisdom to algorithms. You can't delegate ethics to the market. And you can't build a civilization on self-interest alone. That's what the Ayn Rand overdose got wrong. It mistook selfishness for strength and freedom for immunity. But freedom doesn't protect you. It exposes you. It tests whether you can handle reality without supervision. Most people can't. That's why they end up